Welcome to the Faith Trends Podcast, conversations that connect research with ministry.
Welcome to the Faith Trends Podcast. I'm Rick Heemstra, your co-host and the director of the Center for Research on Church and Faith. On today's episode, we're going to hear from Scott Mealey, whose many roles have included actor, church planter, and church researcher. We'll talk with Scott about some of the similarities between congregations and theater audiences, and then draw out some implications for ministry. And as always, Lindsay and I have a brief conversation afterwards to discuss what we heard and what it means for evangelicals in Canada.
Today, we're taking a different approach to Faith Trends. We're not discussing the outcomes and implications of church or ministry research directly, but how research in another field can help us understand people's experience of church, primarily newcomers in this case. So we have Scott Mealey with us, and I first met Scott in person at a small researchers conference, and we had connected because we both share a theater background. But we are also currently working in church research, so that's kind of a niche connection there. But Scott has a PhD in drama, theater, and performance studies, and he's currently serving as Associate Director of the Canadian Institute for Empirical Church Research. And so getting you on the podcast, Scott, was really sparked by a few conversations that we'd had about your research with theater-going audiences. And we were talking about where there might be differences and similarities with church congregations and what the implications are. So, Scott, I want to turn things over to you.
Sure.
Could you briefly tell us what you researched for your PhD?
Yeah, there's what I researched, and then there was sort of a bit of the background of why I did that work. But at the core, I was really interested in this question of change. And specifically, theater will often make claims or hopes that it will change people in a variety of ways. And so what I really wanted to know is, is that true? How would we know if something or someone is changed? What's a reliable source for that? Is there a good way of figuring that out? And what are sort of the conditions that might spark or create the foundation for that change? Is it something in their background, something in the way that they approach theater? Is it something about what the show is doing itself? And, how might we predict contexts in which change does or does not occur? The other part of this is that, and this is part of my other work with audiences, is that there is sometimes the notion of an audience as being a collective entity that somehow moves and operates together, as opposed to an individual audience member. If people change, do they change together or do they change individually? So that's sort of at the foundation of what I was doing. I do spend a bit of time also thinking specifically about what are they going into? Like when they go to theater, like what's the activity they think they're involved in? And is that shaping whether they are changed or not? Spoiler, yes, I think it does. We'll probably get into that as church as well. So that was a bit of what I looked at as well.
There's a couple of terms. You've already alluded to change as an idea, but I'm wondering if you could give us maybe an example of what kind of change an audience or maybe even a particular audience member might experience, just so that we have an idea of what that is. And then you're also going to talk about anxiety.
Yeah.
What do you mean by anxiety?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me start with the change piece. Let me start sort of by thinking about it a bit more globally, because when I did this work, I was thinking sort of was rooted in sort of a lot of psychology and psychological theory. So there's all kinds of different kinds of change. So I first narrowed it down to what we call attitudinal change. In part, it's the way we think about a thing, but it's also a way of thinking about how we orient ourselves towards certain questions and situations in life. So to change our attitude about something means two things. One is a change in direction. We're certainly familiar with this idea in like the church world, right? When we talk about repentance, we often have been exposed to this idea of like we're going in one direction and then we go in another direction. So let's say I have no church background, and at first I don't think that the Bible is true. That is one attitude. And then through a series of events, I become to believe that the the Bible is true. And so now I have repositioned myself sort of on the other side of things. I've changed the direction of my belief. So that is one form. So I was going one way, now I'm thinking in a different kind of way. But another kind of change, which is maybe just as important, actually maybe sometimes more important, is the degree to which that attitude does or does not matter to my overall thinking and orientation in life. This is really important in the church world, especially because if you think about, let's just say something simple like, do you think the Bible is important? Well, if I go into church world, you know, if we were looking at data, we would say that's going to be strongly skewed to the answer yes. That's the Bible is really important. But actually, that is not necessarily helpful to know what people will do. And one of the reasons we study attitudes is because attitudes are one of the best predictors of action. It's not absolute, but it's one of the best ways. And so when we think about changing attitudes, we think that is one of the best ways of changing a behavior. But what's really important is to say, how important is this attitude to me? Because if I think it's really important, it probably is more likely to be impactful in the way I really do things in my life. We know this, for instance, in studies of, let's say, smoking. Almost no one's going to say smoking is good. But the real challenge is not getting people to change their minds about whether it's good or not. The real challenge is, if I think it's bad, how bad do I think it is? If I think it's really bad, then I'm much more likely to quit smoking, for example, or change behavior. Or in the positive side, if I think the Bible is really important, I'm much more likely to have that front of mind, which means I'm probably more likely to build my actions around that belief. So when we look at change, that's really important to understand that if we want to change someone, we're not just trying to reorient the direction they're going, but we might be trying to maybe reinforce, or in some cases, we might be trying to like go the opposite way. We might actually want people to feel something is less important to them. Sometimes people have really strong protective attitudes towards a particular issue or a particular topic. And what we actually want to do is say, this is not as big a deal as you think it is. And that might be the kind of change that we might be interested in. So theater often will do that work as well. We'll try to disrupt the notion that something is critical that actually maybe not be as critical as we think it is. Actually, we see Jesus do this kind of thing when he's talking about, what am I going to wear? What am I going to what am I going to eat? He's not saying that isn't important. He's saying your concern about that is not as pressing as you think it is. So what he's actually trying to do is lessen the import of those questions for us. So that's a different kind of change.
That's really helpful. And anxiety?
So anxiety, I was thinking a little bit about this as well. Sometimes when I define something, I often think about, especially if I'm trying to define something that I'm observing behavior or attitudes in people, what's sometimes helpful for me to define a thing is to say, what is its opposite if someone's talking about it? So in my theater interviews, I had people say things like some form of, I was really anxious or worried or stressed about this thing, but then I just relaxed, or then I just went with the flow. I don't necessarily concern myself in that moment with what's the dictionary definition? What I want to know is what they mean when they say that word. And so knowing the opposite is helpful. And I was thinking a little bit about even a biblical example, in Philippians 4, it sort of talks about don't be anxious about anything, but then the contrast and the peace of God. So actually, again, we see this dichotomy. So we've got peace, which is sort of stability, calmness, lack of emotional fervor. So we can then think about anxiety. We know that anxiety is a state of being aroused or worked up about something. And what my experience has been that anxiety is almost always connected with a sense of a lack of stability, and often connected to that is lack of control. So it's a worry that something will not work out if you don't pay attention to it. You feel anxiety when you feel something is starting to slip out of control and you don't know what's about to happen. In a sense, it's a good thing because it makes us attentive to something that might be problematic or dangerous. But of course, we can get into the nuances. Sometimes we also have the illusion that we can control things that we can't actually control. So it's really about stability. It's really about control. And that happens both in, as you're alluding to, I was shocked that this happens, I think, in most cases in theater. And I've also come to really think that this happens in many cases in churches, especially with people who have little to no background in church. Especially, they feel similar feelings for the same reason, because there's a lack of control. There's that expression that we have, especially in theater audiences or even film audiences, any performance where a person says, I just didn't get it, which seems like a throwaway expression, but if you really think about, I didn't get, like I didn't get control of that. I didn't understand that. I didn't make sense of that thing. And so that thing that we say so often, it really gets at a deeper idea, which is like we want to have some sense of what is this thing that I've just been exposed to? How do I make sense of it? That's sort of the way I kind of think of anxiety.
Yeah, that's really helpful. You clearly have experience and your foot in both worlds, right? You have your foot in the theater world and the church world, and you have
Yeah.
experience as an actor and a pastor. Is
Hmm.
that right?
Yeah, that's right.
So, what would you say are some of the important differences that we should note between theater goers and church goers?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because I actually think that I'm going to have a harder time defending differences between churchgoers and theatergoers than I will the opposite thing. Let's start with number one is that a churchgoer and a theatergoer, neither is a monolithic person, right? People go to churches for a variety of reasons, or when they go to a church, they anticipate different things, they're attuned to different things. And that is one of the things I found with my work as well, is that there's one chapter in the dissertation that basically breaks down to say, hey, generally speaking, there's kind of four kinds of people that go to theater. And so they're paying attention to different kinds of things. I mean, the obvious answer to that question might be saying, oh, when I go to theater, I don't necessarily expect to have an encounter with God. If I go to church, I will. That is not necessarily true. If I say to a theater goer, do you imagine that you will be having a spiritual or divine encounter at the theater? There will be many people who say, yeah, I think that's true. Conversely, if let's take skillfulness, if someone's going to church, do I expect that some of them will care and focus on skillfulness? Absolutely. The after dinner conversation about the quality of the preachers speaking or the worship team's musicality tells me skillfulness is absolutely on the table for people when they go to churches. So, if we sort of generalize to what do people feel like they're going to be having a life-changing experience when they go to theater? Not always, but if I ask people a question about that, they're probably going to be able to give me an answer if they've gone to enough theater. If I say, what has changed your life about theater, they're going to give me something that has had deep impact. Similarly, do people go to church every week and go, I'm definitely going to have my life completely rocked this week? I'm not sure that that is what they're thinking either. So yeah, so the dissimilarities are, I think, a little bit more nuanced. Even something simple like, so, I break down sort of what people anticipate they're going to encounter when they go into theater into sort of four categories. Probably the most popular one is, I think I'm about to encounter a story, and I'm going to identify with the journey of somebody in that story. Well, that might also be something that we might go to in a church service, right? We might say that we are going to walk into something where I am seeing a story that's taking place in the spiritual world or the regular world, and that I see myself somewhere in that. If we sing a song in worship, we often are drawn to songs that are like our stories, and that we see ourselves in that story. Or in a sermon, if someone's telling a biblical, the idea is usually if you're preaching, you want to have people identify with something or someone in that story. So that is pretty common. There is the idea of some people go because it's like ideas. You want to see ideas portrayed sort of in living metaphors, and then you walk away with a deeper reflection on something. Well, Similarly, in church, we might have that, right? Someone might look at the concept of grace or transformation. And the similar, you might illustrate that with a bunch of biblical metaphors or visual or drama or whatever you might do in your church. And again, people walk away with a deeper thought of that. We talked about skillfulness. And then there's the simple piece that now less people do this in theater. It's what's called didactic theater, which is you're going to see real life on stage and you're meant to apply literal moral lessons. Now, that is usually very unpopular in theater. It's you are most likely to see that in schools and traveling. We have a lesson that we're going to teach you. People don't tend to love that style. So there's probably a higher tolerance in churches for you're going to hear about your real life and then take something away from that. So maybe that is the biggest difference, that more people are expecting practical life lessons when they go to church.
From what I'm hearing, it sounds like categorically saying one is entertainment and one is
Yeah.
for worship isn't really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a lot more nuanced.
Yeah. I mean, because partially, even if you say worship, what do we think is happening in worship? What's our imagination for that process? What are we oriented to in worship? Even I think some of the battles over worship are not so much a matter of what is the correct or incorrect way. It's a matter of what do I anticipate that experience to be. So, people will use the expression, well, they're just going for entertainment, this is a question you initially had, but I hate that. That is a word that means nothing at all except to sort of be derogatory towards someone. So even worship is a bit of a complicated idea because the way we think we're engaging or what we're doing or what we're getting out of that or contributing to that is different. I guess the other thing is I would say that in church, you are more likely to be a public and active, visible participant at some stages in church, which is probably why the anxiety levels are even higher in church context, given the likelihood that you are going to be seen and you are expected to do certain kinds of things. Theater also has that, but just maybe to a different degree. At least you're going to be in the dark for most of it.
Scott, I was just thinking when I visited a Pentecostal church and there was a long worship set.
Yeah.
And it just dawned on me that at one point that this worship set in some ways was about creating an expectation that they were going to have an encounter with God in the service.
Yeah.
And it sort of got me thinking about what's the expectation in other denominations or traditions. Sometimes it's, you're waiting for the main event, which is the sermon.
Yeah.
And I noticed that a lot of people, if they say come from the main event as the sermon kind of tradition, when they go into a Pentecostal church, there's a lot of anxiety there about the expectation that you're going to have an encounter with God in this worship service. But it seems to me that you have the Pentecostal church service actually preparing people for what to expect. You want to comment on that and maybe whatever parallels you see between the theater and how churches are doing it?
Yeah, I love that question because I've thought about that question in both contexts a great deal. Let me start in theater because this was such an illuminating moment for me. Part of my money when I was a grad student was you had to participate and volunteer in certain shows. There was a very unusual show, and basically everyone was given a computer tag. And when they walked into the theater space, the actors were performing, but whatever the tags in the room had some sort of modulating effect on the sound. So basically, whoever was in the space changed the sound in some way. Now, they didn't tell anyone that's what was happening. All they walked into was like this thing and the sound was changing. They were walking in. And because I was sort of an usher and I like asking people questions, as you can tell professionally, when people walked out, I would say, "What did you think?" And then they would give me that like, I don't want to be rude, like, "Oh, I was interesting." And they were like wanting to flee. And I said, "Did you know that what was actually happening is when you were in the space or when other people can, the sound changed based on who was in the space." And I remember, I never forgot this. The penny dropped for that person. And I was like, they were instantly like, "I want to go back in now because now I know how to frame the experience that I'm having." And I went, oh, this is a big part of it. It's not that they weren't open to something unusual or even weird. It was that they didn't like being left in the dark about like how to engage that particular experience. I find that in the same way when I was doing church planting, we asked a bunch of questions of people who didn't go to church about reasons they didn't go. And one of them was, there was two. One was about money, and then the second one was about feeling embarrassed. This came up over and over again. And I thought, what does this mean? And they're like, well, I won't know like if I'm supposed to stand or sit. I won't know how to like receive this thing that's taking place. I won't be able to get it. So they weren't de facto concerned about it being a spiritual environment or even a change environment or biblical. It was really what they were concerned about is like, I won't know what to do with this experience, and I might look dumb in the process of doing that. I'll feel embarrassed. And so I think in a similar way, this is one of the reasons in our church we had sort of like this opening preamble to say, hey, this is what's about to happen. Here's what's going on. You can participate or not. That's totally okay. Here are other ways you can participate. This is what our goal is in this situation. So we did that over and over again because we realized that sort of lowered the temperature on their feelings around that. So I think in both worlds, just sort of anticipating what someone might make of something when they walk in is really important. But I'd say even regular people, like to say, here's how I would invite you to orient yourself. Actually, one of the goals in worship of a good worship leader, and the best worship leaders always will do that, to say, here is a way of like considering, here are the questions to consider or ways you might approach what we're thinking about as we go into worship today or a sermon. So I think that actually is a really easy solution to lots of things, and also creates openness for the very thing that you want to communicate that. But it's easy to forget if you are used to, if you understand the world that you're coming in, understand its questions, understand its practices, understand what is normal or acceptable. Can I just add one other thing? Because this was something that was a massive realization I had. So we had this, of course, similar idea that what we wanted is to have people really encounter God, have powerful experience with God. And we thought, if that happens, success. And so we would have these people who've never come to church before come in. At the end, they're crying. They're like, something happened. I felt something. And then I would never see them again. And I thought, what's the deal? Like we accomplished our mission, but here's what I came to realize. They had no framework for this feeling that they were having of being undone. In church world, we have a story that says we have this encounter with God. It messes us up a bit, but guess what? This story turns out really well because being messed up is what leads you to something good. But if you don't have that story, you just think you're going crazy or like you're losing your mind or you're being sucked into a cult. And we start to hear those stories to say, oh, like we need not just a framework in the service, we need a framework to like help them understand the encounter that they just had and that like they're not losing it. This is actually a good news kind of story.
Reminds me, I grew up in the United Church, and they always had the same order of service. And in fact, we always sang the same opening hymn. It was Holy, Holy, Holy.
Yeah.
But you know what? You're in that. You do know what to expect.
Yeah.
And I think that probably a lot of us grew up knowing what church was going to be.
Yeah.
To the point where we didn't think we had to explain it.
Interestingly, the flip side of this, going back to this research, is that what I found with theater goers, if they were regular theater goers going to the kind of theater they were used to going, they were the least likely to be changed as well. They might have positive feelings, but they were probably not going to be changed in their attitudes about something. So this is sort of where I came to realize, oh, disruption, if change is what you're after, there has to be some kind of disruption. And then it's just sort of like keeping it between the lines of too much disruption or not enough. So I think that is the part of the challenge, like of the regular churchgoer, is if they know everything that's going to happen, then their brains, their minds, and their beings probably easily just like let that go and it just rolls over them. It doesn't actually do anything to them.
This is so interesting. I'm just thinking if we could draw some connections for ministry leaders who are listening, how can they recognize anxiety in churchgoers? And maybe do you have any suggestions for how they can help implement a framework not only within the experience, but outside of it? If people are experiencing God and coming away and they have no framework to process that,
Yeah.
what are extra church service, outside of the church service framework that people can go to help process the change that they've just experienced?
Yes, that's a great question. And it's interesting. I just came out of another meeting where I was working with this organization called the Center for Spectatorship and Audience Research, which is specifically our goal has been to say, we have some really basic things. One is, if you want to know about audiences, talk to them, which sounds super obvious, but has not happened most of the time in audience studies in theater. And probably in a parallel, I would say that one of the best ways of knowing if people feel a certain way in churches is to talk to them. That is part of the thing. So anxiety, one of the challenges of anxiety is that it's usually not visible to people from the outside. And the only way you would start to have it visible to you is if you, are pretty good at paying attention to someone. So can you see if someone looks tense or if they look like, there's a bit of sweat there or, they're pretty stiff? And are you close enough to them to actually do that thing? One of the reasons I got into this work in academia was because I was so annoyed at the way actors said they understood what was happening in the audience. And I was like, you don't know anything. Like, you're in the dark, you're in the middle of a performance. These little things like the coughs or the shifting, that can mean anything at all. This is make believe. But then I started to realize, oh, this is happening. If you're preaching, if I'm speaking in front of a bunch of people, there's lots of times I'm like, oh, these people are not into it. They hate it. They're like, there's no response. And in fact, they were deeply moved. Sometimes people are deeply moved are like super still and they look they look a little bit spacey. And sometimes it's because they're just going deep inside of themselves. And conversely, the people who are like, yeah, I'm really into this are just like supportive. That's what they are. And so part of it is a bit of humility around the fact that we're not good at snap decisions about how people are doing. So we've got to create a culture in which we safely talk to people, much like I would try to create the conditions. If I'm interviewing someone about a show, I know that I need to create a space that they feel safe in. I know that they need to be reassured their responses are anonymous and that no one's feelings are going to be hurt. That's a big issue because people don't want to hurt the artist's feelings. So that is a bit of a challenge for me. So in a similar way, if I want to talk to people about what's happening in my church, I have to create conditions in which people feel safe to share and that they are reassured that they aren't acting in an unloving or uncaring kinds of ways, because that will be top of mind. So creating a culture in which you engage people on a regular basis, like tell me what's actually going on. The other piece is to ask, I think, the right kinds of questions. So one of the ways I came to understand anxiety was taking place was a question around memory. So I would say, tell me the first thing that you remember about what just happened during that experience. It can be anything at all. If you had to go to the bathroom, that's the first thing you can say that. You can, if you didn't like the chairs, you can say that. There was a reason for that. It's because the brain has this way of making judgments about what is or is not important. So whatever is top of mind, whatever comes first, something in that brain said, hey, that is especially important that you hold on to that thing. And usually a brain holds on to something because it's concerned. That's usually the number one reason. Brains have memories. A friend of mine, Brent, because it needs to address something. It thinks it needs to address something. So I started getting all these memories about the beginnings of shows. I went, I don't understand this. Like, they're not talking about like the key moment in the plot. They're not talking about the ending. They're talking about the beginning of a show. And I could not understand that. And then I went, oh, I start to realize what was happening. It's because that's the moment that they feel most worried. Because they're like, okay, I'm walking into something. I don't understand what it's going to be like. And so they're making lots of cognitive decisions. What is the thing I'm about to see? How am I going to orient myself? What's my attitude towards that? So there's a lot of energy, which is why the brain holds on to it. So in a similar way, I love memory questions so much now that I always have them in anything I do with other people. I have a memory question because that memory question will tell me what a person feels is most pressing to them. And it's also a bit of a gut response as opposed to sort of an analytical, like outside of person, because I have found that people are not always great at knowing when something is happening or when they have been changed by something. They know what their feelings are, but they aren't always clear why they have the feelings they have. And if you sort of force them to answer that, then they're going to make something up in a loving, generous way. They will make things up for you. So it's better to sort of focus on what they're confident with and then to sort of do the detective work of then walking backwards to say, okay, you talked about this feeling. Slow walk me through what you're imagining or thinking about in that moment. So I might say that to someone in a church context to say, like, tell me what you remember most, or maybe have someone, probably if you're the pastor, it's not good if you were involved. So it's better to have maybe someone who's not directly involved. That helps mediate a bit to say, hey, talk to me about like, what do you remember? What like stood out to you? Or where were you having the biggest feelings? And then to sort of walk through those kinds of stories.
These kind of questioning scenarios, is it happening right after the performance? I'm thinking of when you were doing the research, or was there some time that had passed?
So, yeah, that's a good question. In theory, it's better to ask immediately, but practically, I found that if I waited a week or two afterwards, that there was still what we might think of as a kind of hardiness of memory about the most pressing memories. And in some ways, the less durable encounters sort of fade away. I always use this example of there was the show, I can't even remember the name of it, which will illustrate what I'm about to say. I went to a great show in Toronto. It was a big Mervish show. Went with my wife. It was Valentine's Day. I remember being very moved and crying. And then the next day I went, "So what was that show about again?" I don't even remember its name now. And then I went, oh, there was a kind of feeling that happened in that moment that was not hearty. It wasn't actually important to me. I felt those feelings in that moment, but in the long term, there was nothing that said, hey, you need to hold on to this kind of thing. So sometimes I found a bit of distance helped me know what remained and what continued to circulate in a person's mind and their being, you know? So I actually think a week is not a bad idea because it gives a bit of distance and then some of the immediate stuff sort of filters off. So that's just a soft piece of advice I would give if someone was to do something like that.
Scott, this is so fascinating, and I wish we had more time. I'm going to ask one more question.
Sure, yeah.
And I'm going to go back to this idea that you talked about earlier, where if you want to know what the audience is feeling, whether it's anxiety, that you should ask them.
Yeah.
So I've been a pastor, and as a pastor, you preach, and you're doing several different things, right? So a lot of you're focusing on your delivery, you're focusing on content. It's sometimes very difficult to actually look out over the people in the congregation and try in that time to discern what they're experiencing.
Yeah.
What would be your advice for someone who is trying to make the people comfortable and yet may have anxiety of their own about preaching?
Yeah, that's right.
What would you say to them? For example, there's some traditions where it's more call and response. So if you were in a black church, you might actually be more comfortable talking and getting feedback from the audience. But if you go into a Caucasian church, well, that's just not done.
Yeah, I think part of it is that, well, so if you want a kind of interaction, part of it is learning to create the conditions in which you say, this is the kind of thing that I would like to do. So in the church I was at, that sort of millennial non-church background, we had a thing where people could interrupt me and ask questions if they wanted to. Now, sometimes I might pin a thing and say, hey, we'll get to this a bit later on. But that was part of the tradition we had established to some degree because I wanted them in the moment. If something occurred to them or I didn't want them to sort of pass it by and like learn to like turn things off. And for me, that was really helpful because then Yeah, this is directly to your question. That gave me a sense of like what was actually going on in them because I might have a bunch of material, but I wasn't necessarily going to know what was going to super resonate with them in any given moment or what they might not understand in a something that seemed obvious to me. So what was nice about that encounter was they could immediately just say, I don't know what you mean by that. And then I could go, oh, great. Like, I'm super thankful that I know that you don't now. I can do something about it. So that's why I think some folks have turned to this question and answer period. Part of it is to address that. I also would like to say that I'm not fundamentally against some anxiety. Anxiety will be normal and necessary if you want to change. People don't like change. let's just full stop. There's something in us. We want stability. That's what we desperately want. And we will put up with a lot of awfulness. I've been going through the book of Exodus again. And what a great example of a group of people who want to go back to something that was horrible. Why? Because of stability. That was a stable for them. So you've got to kind of walk people through. You want to create a bit of a controlled anxiety situation. I also, at a certain point, really changed my way of thinking as a pastor, and I started thinking over a series of weeks. Part of it, I wish I had known this research, which turned out that change is probably going to happen, but it's going to be small, and you need to understand if you want to take a long journey, you've got to make small changes in attitude over time. So I started to think of my sermon series as like a 6-week process, and I always had kind of the same structure, which is week 1 or 2 is about saying, this is what we're going to do, and I'm going to try to destabilize you. So that is the goal. There's no answers here. You need to like come to terms with the fact that this is something that needs to be destabilized in your thinking. And I'm straight up about that. Part of it was not shocking them. Like I'm saying I'm working towards disruption, so you can prepare yourself for that. And it wasn't a surprise. I knew in order for them then to think through an alternative way of thinking, they needed to actually feel like what I have right now is not enough. So that's important. And then to slowly walk them into alternative ways of thinking about a kind of thing. And I would sort of say, what's the journey? What do I anticipate is the challenge to this journey for them? What are the feelings? What needs to be destabilized? And I would like, in a very dramatic structure way, I mapped out that journey as if it was a show. This is what I expect this show over 6 weeks is going to look like. It needs to start here with this kind of conflict, and then we build towards the pinnacle here. So that's something I would recommend, is to say, have a theory of change. Don't guess at that. Have a theory of change about what you think might be going on, and then plan for the change that you think will last, and then have ways, outlets to say, if something is going off the rails or if people aren't getting something, like what is the forum for people to give feedback along the way?
That's great.
Cool.
Now, Scott, we're coming to an end here, but you haven't written yet on some of these findings and their implications for the church. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how can listeners learn more about this?
In my capacity here at the Canadian Institute for Empirical Church Research, we are looking at the notion of an audience study, actually. So if you're a part of a church right now that would like to be part of that study, we would love to actually have some churches that would like to do a year-long experiment where we can ask some of the questions I've been talking about that I might have done in a theater context, obviously recontextualized, and to say, what would happen if we start to ask these questions as a normal process? What I'm saying is I'd love to do that study, and then I'll publish results and I will share that with folks. They can certainly contact me about some of that. And then we are talking about church decline, mostly financially, but we are going to eventually get into the psychology of that. But people continue to go to our website, the Canadian Institute of Empirical Church Research, which I think is cicr.wycliffecollege.ca, which is where we're housed. So we will continue to be publishing things there. And obviously they can always reach out and talk to me anytime they would like. If they want to get into the mechanics of change and measuring it, I have written about some of that in theater world, but the math is the same. And the way I'm suggesting it would look the same way. So if they're interested in that, they can do that as well. So
Sure. Definitely. We'll include all of these items
or
in
just read the
the show
conclusions.
notes.
That'll
Or
get
read the
you to most of it. fairly quickly. So,
No, that's great, Scott. We will link everything in our show notes, but thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was great. Enjoyed chatting with both of you.
Lindsay, I thought that Scott was just so helpful in this idea that we have to prepare people for what they're going to experience in the church services. As I was kind of saying to Scott, when I was growing up, we knew what was going to happen in church. It was very stable in terms of an order of service. And yet, even when I'm preaching now, not just about what's going to happen in the service, but I find that I need to explain things like, what is the Bible and why are we looking at it?
I think we're in an age where the church or having a church background is no longer an assumption. And so maybe we need to question our assumptions as we're walking into church or conducting services and think about who is sitting in the pews or whatnot. I guess they're not really pews in many churches anymore, but they're in itself is a bit of an assumption. I've been conducting a lot of interviews recently, and one of the questions that we have on our screener is, did you grow up as a Christian? I'm really surprised, maybe I shouldn't be, but most of the people who consider themselves Christians now have grown up in a Christian church and have a framework for what church is like. So I see that idea of disrupting in order to bring about transformation or change is really interesting. How do we disrupt the people who've grown up with these assumptions and that this is what we're expecting out of the church experience? I think it's interesting that Scott's saying this is not just for newcomers, but there's also a role for this to play with those who've been here for a long time.
Yeah, and even as we use language like disruption, there's a part of me that thinks, oh well, that sounds like you're maybe manipulating people slightly, but at the same time, maybe a language that I would like better is, what's your goal? Because, as we've been talking about the similarities between the experience of an audience and the experience of a congregation, I think you and I were talking earlier that a congregation is not strictly an audience because we have something to do. And I suppose that Scott would say that the audience has something to do when they're viewing a play as well. But I think as a church, there's a more specific thing that we're supposed to be doing anyway, is participating in the worship service. And I wonder, if we have to do a better job of helping people to understand what their role is in a worship service. Because I think sometimes we've actually assumed that the important stuff is going up on the platform. And we talk about the congregation as an audience, and that kind of gives them permission to be observers.
Yeah, I think you're onto something. And, are there ways that we've structured, as you said, our language or even our buildings to reinforce that idea?
Yeah, for sure. I'm just so appreciative of the thought and the insight that Scott brings to this topic. I'm going to certainly be thinking about what is the first thing that people are going to remember out of this service, and how do I recognize anxiety in people, and how can I help them to be better prepared to experience God in worship.
Thanks for listening to this intentionally ad-free podcast. Find out more about the EFC's research and how you can support it with a donation at theefc.ca/research.